The box was sitting in the corner of a dirt floor cellar, packed tight with old hay, and I almost stepped right over it. I didn't know yet that it was the answer to a question that had been eating at me for 2 years. Here's what I'd figured out by that point. Millions of Canadians right now are watching their retirement fall apart. Not because they save too little, but because everything costs more than the plan ever imagined. And yet I'd found people who retired on almost nothing decades ago and lived warm and fed and calm. The difference wasn't money. It was a handful of forgotten methods, and the biggest one was hiding in a wooden box in a farmhouse cellar outside Perth, Ontario. It was a cold Tuesday last November when a woman named Eileen handed me her grandmother's household ledger and told me to look at the number at the bottom of the page. I want to walk you back through the whole trail, clue by clue, all the way to that box, because the thing inside it is simple enough that you could build one this weekend, in the home you already live in, whether you own it or rent it. Stay with me, because this changes what retirement even has to mean. Let me start where the obsession started. I'm in my late 50s. A couple of years back, I sat down and did the math that a lot of you have probably done at your own kitchen table. I looked at what a pension covers now, and what a week of groceries costs, and what the heating bill did over one bad winter, and I felt the floor tilt. The plan I'd been sold my whole life, the one where you save, you retire, you're comfortable, that plan was quietly coming apart in my hands, and I got angry. Then I got curious. Because here's the thing that wouldn't leave me alone. My grandparents retired on a pension so small it would make you laugh today. No investments to speak of. And they were never cold, never hungry, never in a panic about a bill. So either they knew something we've forgotten, or they suffered quietly and nobody told me. I decided to find out which. That question is what put me on the road, driving out to farm country, knocking on doors, sitting at kitchen tables with people in their 80s and 90s who still had the old ways in their hands. It's what sent me digging through provincial archives and old agricultural college bulletins that hadn't been opened in decades. And every single lead pointed back toward the same buried idea, an idea somebody made very sure we would forget. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me show you the ledger first, because that's where the mystery really cracked open. Eileen's grandmother kept a household book. Every farm woman of that generation did. It's a plain-line notebook, and in it she wrote down what the household spent, week by week, going back to the 1930s and running clear into the 1960s. Eileen had kept it in a drawer, the way you keep a thing you can't quite throw out. I opened it, expecting sad little numbers. What I found stopped me. For long stretches of the year, this family of 6 spent almost nothing on food. Not a little. Almost nothing. There'd be a purchase of flour, some salt, some sugar, a bit of tea, and then week after week after week, with barely a grocery entry at all. And this wasn't a rich family. The father's income, for a whole year, would fit in what a lot of people spend on a used car today. So the first clue landed hard. These people weren't buying most of what they ate, which meant they were storing it, and storing it in a way that let it last for months without a freezer, without a fridge running day and night, without a single dollar going to the power company to keep it cold. I circled that in my notebook and I underlined it twice because I realized I had no idea how you keep a winter's worth of food from rotting. I'd never been taught. Nobody my age was. And that was the first time I felt it. That cold little drop in the stomach. How much had we simply lost? How much were we paying every month for something our grandparents got for free? I had to know how they did it. Therefore, I went looking for the room where the food was kept. Eileen took me down into the cellar, and that's where the trail really began. It wasn't a basement like we think of one. It was a proper root cellar, dug into the side of a slope, with thick stone walls and a low ceiling and a smell of earth and apples that I can still bring back if I close my eyes. And it was cold, not freezing. Cold in a steady, deep way. The kind of cold that doesn't come from a machine. Here's what took me a while to understand, and what I want you to understand, because it's the first piece of the puzzle that actually saves you money. A properly built root cellar sits at a temperature just above freezing, somewhere around 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, and it holds a very high humidity, up around 90%. That combination, cold and damp and dark, is exactly what most root vegetables want. Potatoes, carrots, beets, turnips, cabbages, onions, apples. Stored right, they don't last a week or two. They last the whole winter. Carrots packed in damp sand will come out crisp in March. Potatoes in the dark, kept cool, will feed you until the new ones come up in the garden. Now, the science on this isn't folklore. It's been measured. The Ontario Agricultural College at Guelph, which goes all the way back to 1874, was publishing practical storage bulletins for farm families, telling them exact temperatures and exact methods for keeping the harvest through a Canadian winter. This was taught, this was known, and a woman named Adelaide Hoodless helped found the MacDonald Institute at that same college in 1903, specifically to teach household science, the science of running a home so it fed and warmed a family for next to nothing. There was an entire body of knowledge, backed by a real institution, aimed at exactly the problem you and I are staring at right now. So the first clue resolved. That's how the grocery line in the ledger stayed near zero. They grew it in summer, and the cellar kept it in winter, and the cellar ran on nothing but the temperature of the earth itself. I remember standing in that cellar feeling something close to relief. And then a bigger question opened up under my feet, and it's the question that drove the rest of the whole investigation. Because food, it turns out, was never the number that broke people. I ran the ledger forward, and I compared it to my own bills. And the thing that's actually crushing retirements today isn't the grocery run. It's the energy. It's the heat. It's the cost of keeping a house warm and cooking the food once you've grown it. That's the line that's gone wild. And that's where the trail got strange, because the deeper I dug into how old Canadians kept warm and cooked cheap, the more it felt like someone had come along later and swept the evidence out the door. But before I get to who did the sweeping, I need to show you the next thing I found, because it's the part that matters most for the house you're sitting in right now. Let me speak straight to you for a minute, especially if you've been thinking this whole time that none of this applies to you. Maybe you're renting. Maybe you're in an apartment, or a house that's 60, 70, 80 years old, with drafty windows and a landlord who'll never let you dig a root cellar or touch the furnace. I know that thought, because I had it myself, standing in Eileen's cellar, thinking, well, that's lovely for a farm, but I don't have a slope to dig into. So this next part is for you specifically, the person in the older home, the person who can't renovate, the person who assumes the old ways need a homestead. They don't. That's exactly the point I want to make. The old-timers didn't keep warm by heating the whole house. That idea, the idea that every room should be the same cozy temperature all winter, is brand new, historically speaking, and it's part of what's draining your bank account. They heated the person, and they heated one room, and they kept the heat they made from escaping, and every trick they used for that, you can use tonight, in a rental, with no permit and no contractor and nobody's permission. Here's the first one, and it's almost embarrassing how simple it is. They banked the cold out at the windows. In the old houses I visited, people talked about hanging heavy blankets or quilts over the windows once the sun went down, and pulling them back in the morning to let the low winter sun in. A window is the biggest hole in your wall for heat to run out of. A single thick curtain or an old wool blanket tacked up over a drafty window at night can cut the cold pouring off that glass dramatically. It costs you nothing but a blanket you already own. Second trick, and this one I tested in my own place. The old settlers sealed the gaps. Before there was fancy weather stripping, people rolled up cloth, old socks, rags, into a long tube and laid it along the bottom of every door to stop the draft crawling across the floor. Your grandmother called it a draft snake. You can make one in 10 minutes. And they'd stuff rag and paper into the cracks around window frames where the cold whistled in. In a leaky old house, sealing those gaps is the single biggest thing you can do, and the research backs it up. A shocking amount of a home's heat loss comes from air simply leaking in and out through gaps you can't even see. Plug them and you feel the difference the same night. Third, and this is the one that changed how I live. They closed off the rooms they weren't using. They shut the doors. They didn't heat the spare room and the front parlor and the hallway. They pulled the family into one warm room in the evening, usually the kitchen, because it was already warm from cooking, and they let the rest of the house go cold. If you've got rooms you barely use, shut the vents, shut the doors, hang a curtain across a cold hallway, and stop paying to heat space nobody's standing in. On a fixed income, that alone can take a real bite out of the bill, and no landlord can stop you doing it. None of that needs money. None of it needs permission. All of it came straight from people who retired warm on almost nothing. So the reassurance I want you to take is this. You are not locked out of any of this because of the home you live in. The old knowledge was made for exactly your situation. A family with little money and a house that leaked. Because back then, that was almost everybody. Now here's where I got the satisfaction of one more clue solved, and where the whole thing turned dark. Because as I sat there feeling clever about my draft snake, one number in that ledger still didn't add up, and that number is what finally led me to the box in the cellar. But first I had to figure out who took all of this away from us, and why. Let me tell you when I first smelled something wrong. I was in a small archive, going through old household bulletins and advertisements from the 1940s, 1950s, and into the 1960s, and I watched something happen on the page, right in front of me, across the years. In the earlier material, all this knowledge is just there. How to store food cold. How to cook with less fuel. How to keep a house warm cheaply. It's presented plainly, the way you'd tell someone how to change a tire. And then, moving forward through the decades, it starts to vanish. Not because it stopped working, it worked as well as it ever had. It vanished because something new showed up to replace it. And that something new had a price tag, and behind that price tag was a company that needed you to keep paying it month after month for the rest of your life. And every trick they used for that, you can use tonight in a rental with no permit and no contractor and nobody's permission. If you want to go deeper into all of this before we continue, I've put much more of it together in a book. It's called Canadian Edge, and it goes through the full system, root cellar methods, fireless cooking, heat management, all of it, laid out step by step so you can start using it in whatever home you're living in right now. There's also Canadian Complete and Deep Canadian, which go further into the same tradition. You'll find them mentioned in the description below. Everything in them came from the same trail I've been walking you through today, and none of it requires anything you don't already have. But let's get back to the trail. Because as I sat there feeling clever about my draft snake, one number in that ledger still didn't add up. Think about what got sold to us in those years. The electric refrigerator, running around the clock, replacing the root cellar that ran on nothing. The full house furnace and the idea that every room must be warm, replacing the one warm room and the banked windows. The convenience appliance for every task. And every one of those things quietly moved a cost that used to be zero onto your monthly bill and locked it there. I'm not saying a fridge is evil. I've got one. I'm saying that somewhere in there, a trade got made on our behalf, and nobody asked us. We were sold convenience, and in exchange we handed over self-reliance, and we didn't notice that convenience is something you rent forever while self-reliance is something you own. The companies selling the appliances and the power to run them had every reason in the world to make the old ways look like poverty, like something backward you'd be ashamed to do. And it worked. It worked so well that people like me grew up never even hearing that a root cellar existed. That's who swept the trail. Not one villain in a dark room. A whole tide of marketing that made forgetting feel like progress. And the proof is in the ledger. Because Eileen's grandmother's spending on power and fuel stayed low for decades, and then, right on schedule with the ads I was reading, it started to climb, and it never came back down. Now here's the number that still didn't add up, the one I promised you. Even in the coldest months, even when she was cooking for 6 people every single day, her fuel use for cooking barely moved. Cooking a full meal every day all winter should burn a lot of fuel. Hers didn't. And when I asked Eileen how her grandmother cooked, she said, "Oh, She had that box. She'd start something on the stove and then she'd put it in the box and go do her chores and come back and it was done. That box, the one packed with hay in the corner of the cellar that I'd almost stepped over. Therefore, I went back down those cellar stairs, and this time I got down on my knees and I really looked. And what I found is the thing I most want to give you, because it's the answer to the whole mystery, and it's so simple you're going to wonder how it was ever allowed to disappear. It was a wooden box, lined and packed thick with hay and a bit of old wool, with a nest hollowed out in the middle just the size of a cooking pot, and a thick cushion of hay to press down on top. And that, right there, is what our great-grandparents called a fireless cooker. Some called it a hay box. And it is, I am convinced, one of the most quietly powerful money-saving tools that ordinary Canadians have almost completely forgotten. Here is how it works. And I need you to hear how simple this is, because the simplicity is the whole point. You take your pot of food, say it's a stew, or dried beans, or a porridge, or a tough cheap cut of meat, or soup. You bring it to a full rolling boil on the stove, the regular way, and you let it boil hard for just a few minutes. Then you take the whole pot, lid on tight, and you nest it down into the box, packed all around and on top with hay, or wool, or crumpled newspaper, or old blankets, anything that traps heat. You close the lid of the box, and you walk away. That's it. That's the secret. The food is already at boiling temperature, and the insulation is so complete that the pot cools down painfully slowly, staying hot enough to keep cooking for hours. The heat you already put in does all the rest of the work. You go do your chores, you go to town, you sit and rest your feet, and 4 or 5 hours later you open the box and the beans are tender and the stew is done and the meat falls off the bone. The food cooked itself, on heat you'd already made, and would otherwise have thrown away up the chimney. And I did not want to believe this, I'll be honest with you. It sounded too good. It sounded like a story an old woman tells. So I built one myself. A cardboard box, a wooden crate, packed with an old wool blanket and some towels, a hollow in the middle for the pot. I boiled a pot of dried beans for about 5 minutes, sealed it in, and I left it. Hours later I lifted the lid and the beans were perfectly completely cooked, and the pot was still hot enough that I was careful lifting it. I ran a whole meal on a few minutes of stove fuel. I stood in my kitchen, and I actually laughed out loud, because I'd been paying for those hours of cooking my entire adult life for no reason at all. This isn't a trick somebody made up. This is documented, real Canadian and old country practical knowledge. The fireless cooker was written up in agricultural and household bulletins in the early 1900s and pushed hard during the First World War, when fuel was scarce and every household was told to conserve. The domestic science people, the very tradition Adelaide Hoodless helped start at Guelph in 1903, taught this. Government bulletins from that era laid out exactly how to build one, and claimed it could cut the fuel you burned for cooking by well over half. Some said as much as 3/4, because you only heat the food once and then let insulation finish the job. Over a winter of daily cooking, that is a genuinely large amount of money and energy, and it never once shows up as a monthly bill, because a hay box doesn't send you an invoice. Think about what that means for the problem we started with. The thing breaking retirements is the monthly bleed, the power and the fuel and the endless running cost of a modern house. The fireless cooker attacks that directly. It takes one of the hungriest energy jobs in your home, hours of simmering and slow cooking, and it feeds it almost entirely for free. It works with the cheapest food there is, dried beans and lentils and tough cuts and root vegetables, the exact foods that fill a root cellar. The two methods were designed to work together. Store cheap food cold for free, then cook it slow for free. That's the whole engine. That's how 6 people ate all winter for the price of flour and tea. And here's why it disappeared, and why it made me so angry once I understood it. There's no money in it for anyone but you. Nobody can sell you a hay box that needs refilling. Nobody can meter the heat you didn't waste. A slow cooker you plug in, that they can sell you, and it draws power every hour it runs. But a box of hay that cooks your dinner on heat you already made and would have thrown away, that's a gift with no revenue attached, and things with no revenue attached tend to get quietly left out of the story until nobody remembers them at all. Well, I remember now. And now you do too. Let me tell you exactly how to build one this weekend, because I want this in your hands, not just in your head. You need a container that holds heat, and a pot that fits inside it with room all around. A sturdy cardboard box works. A wooden crate works better. A cooler, the kind you take camping, works wonderfully, because it's already built to hold temperature. Line the bottom with a thick layer of insulation, and here you have choices. Real hay or straw if you're rural. Crumpled newspaper packed tight. Old wool blankets or sweaters. Even towels. Wool is best because it holds heat and doesn't mind a little steam. You want a good few inches of it on the bottom, around the sides, and a thick cushion or pillow of it to press down on top of the pot. Nest your pot down into the middle so it's surrounded on every side. Use a heavy pot with a tight lid, cast iron or thick stainless, because a heavy pot holds its heat longer, and that's the whole game. Bring your food to a hard boil on the stove. Boil it a good 5 to 10 minutes so the pot and the food are thoroughly, deeply hot all the way through. Then lower it into the nest, press the top cushion down firmly over the lid, close the box, and leave it be. Don't peek. Every time you open it, you let the heat out. For beans and grains and stews, give it 4 to 6 hours. For a big pot of soup or a tough roast, you can leave it most of the day. A few honest tips, because I made mistakes so you don't have to. Fill the pot fairly full. A bigger mass of hot food holds heat far longer than a small one, so this method loves a big batch, which is perfect because a big batch is cheaper per meal anyway. Pack the insulation tight. Gaps are where the heat escapes. And if you're ever nervous about food safety with a long, slow cook, the rule is simple. You start it at a full boil and it stays hot for hours. But if it's cooled to lukewarm by the time you open it, bring it back up to a boil on the stove for a few minutes before serving, exactly the way the old bulletins told people to. Do that and you cook cheaply and safely, the same way households did for generations before us. Start with dried beans this weekend. They're pennies a pound, they're one of the most nourishing foods there is, and they are the perfect first test, because you'll see plainly that they cooked with almost no fuel. Once you've watched it work with your own eyes, the way I did in my kitchen, you'll start reaching for that box without even thinking, and the running cost of your kitchen will quietly fall month after month for as long as you live in that home. That's the thing I found in the corner of a cellar outside Perth, Ontario on a cold Tuesday last November. A wooden box packed with hay that answered a 2-year question and handed me back something I didn't know had been taken. So let me leave you with what this really is, because it was never just about a box or a cellar. It's the quiet, steadying knowledge that you are not helpless in front of a bill you didn't choose, that the people who came before you faced worse with less, and stayed warm and fed and calm, and that everything they knew is still true, still sitting there, waiting for anyone willing to go looking. Your retirement doesn't have to depend on numbers you can't control. It can depend, at least a little more, on what you can do with your own 2 hands in your own kitchen. I think you're the kind of person who already suspected this. The kind who felt, somewhere in the back of your mind, that we'd been sold a more expensive life than we needed, and that somebody profited every time an old, free way of doing things got called backward and thrown out. You were right. You were right the whole time. So here's what I want you to do. When you build your fireless cooker, tell me what you cooked in it and how long you left it, and tell me one thing. Did you use hay, wool, newspaper, or something else for your packing? Put it down in the comments. I read them, and other people trying this for the first time need to hear what worked for you. Don't just nod along and scroll away. Take 1 minute and leave the comment, because this only stays alive if we pass it hand to hand. And if you feel that pull, the pull to reclaim the things that were quietly buried so someone else could keep charging us for them, then come along with me. This isn't about following a channel, it's about a group of us digging the old knowledge back up before the last people who remember it are gone. because the next trail I'm on leads to how those same families kept meat and butter fresh through a whole summer with no refrigeration at all, using nothing but cold water and a clay pot, and one clever trick I did not believe until I saw the temperature drop with my own thermometer. I'll show you that one next. Bring your skepticism. I did. It didn't survive. If you're still with me, this is where I hand you the rest. Members get the whole thing, right where I stopped, the root cellar system, room by room, ready for your own home. Inside the Northern Ways circle, you can ask me your own question, and a real person answers. Not a machine. You won't be alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code. Cancel anytime, one click. Hope to see you inside.